Hey, what's going on, B-Wood? We are in week 3 of our series, Us for Them. Now, got a question. How many of you have ever won a trophy? Now, I know that I've won some trophies back in my day, and one of the things I like about getting a trophy is that it feels good to win. It feels good to hold the trophy or the medal, and it feels good to celebrate because you won. But if you've never won a trophy, you also know what it feels like to lose. Now, when it comes to sports, there's rivalries and there's all of that. And when it comes to sports, Dell and I can pretty much agree on 99% of the teams that we root for. But there's one sport that we don't see eye to eye. It's baseball. You see, for me, I root and cheer for the 27-time World Series champions. While Dell, on the other hand, she roots for the Houston Astros, right? So every year our teams play against each other, and every year during that time, we hope and pray that our teams would win. Because we can't stand the fact to hear it from the other person that their team beat our team. And so I'm guessing that you, like me, have rooted for people to fail in some way, some shape or form. Whether it's a missed field goal, whether it's something that happened academically, sometimes sad to admit, we've wanted to see people fail. And that's what I love about our conversation that we're gonna have today. This conversation that we're gonna have, we're talking about a man by the name of Jonah. You see, last week we talked about a man by the name of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah had this message to the people of Israel. You see, God had called him a prophet, and he gave him this message, and he told him, hey, this message is specifically for my people. But today I want to talk to you about a man who was reluctant to do what it is that God had called him to do. If you've ever been around church long enough or read the Bible long enough, you know the story of Jonah. And for most of us, we know the story of Jonah and the whale. But what we missed about Jonah's story was that Jonah was a prophet, and he was called to speak to the city of Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was this huge city, and it had this reputation from everyone that nobody really liked this city, including Jonah. You see, Nineveh was the capital of this kingdom, Assyria, and the Assyrians were the same people guilty of conquering the nation of Israel. And with all of that conquering came rape, murder, and destruction of the nations they conquered. And a lot of people hated Nineveh, but God's people, the Israelites, you see, it was a pretty justifiable reason for them to hate them. Jonah chapter 1, verse 1 through 3 says this: the word of the Lord came to Jonah. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord, and he headed towards Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship that was bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed to Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Now, you know that feeling you get when your parents tell you you have to do maybe your chore, or maybe have to clean your room, and you do everything you possibly can to avoid that? You see, that's what Jonah was finding himself in that situation. You see, he ignored the directions that God specifically said for him to do. I want you to go to Nineveh. You see, Jonah had a lot of things that he was interested in, but one thing that he was not interested in, he was not interested in preaching to the Ninevites. You see, he hated them, and whether it was wrong or not, he hated them, and he didn't want to talk to him, and he was hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would delay it long enough for God to just say, you know what, I'll do it myself, and I'll destroy the city. But see, one of the most incredible things about the story of Jonah is not that he became the breakfast for that whale, but it was how far he went to avoid the command to help enemies hear from God. You see, Jonah's disobedience to God and his hatred for the enemies led to some pretty ridiculous consequences. And as we follow the story of Jonah, we see that he finally does obey God. He finally decides to go to Nineveh. God gives him a second chance to do that. He shows up and he's the stranger in this city. He declares to everyone, hey, I just want to give you a heads up. Because God spoke to me and he said that if you don't turn from your wicked ways, if you don't stop what you're doing, God's going to destroy this city. And despite the efforts of Jonah, whether it was his best efforts or whether it was his worst efforts, the people of Nineveh believed him. And they believed him and they repented. They turned from their evil ways, and God says, great, now I don't have to destroy you. And that's it. Problem solved. God's will be done. Right? Not exactly. If we go on a little bit further down, Jonah chapter 4, verse 1 through 3 says this, but Jonah seemed very wrong and became angry. He prayed to the Lord, isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to predict by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you were gracious and you were a compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it's better for me to die than it is to live. You see, in this moment, thanks to Jonah, God spared Nineveh from destruction. But Jonah, on the other hand, he was angry. He was angry because he wanted his enemies to burn. He wanted the destruction of Nineveh to really happen. Don't forget all the horrible things that the Assyrians people had done to his people. You could kind of understand a little bit where Jonah's coming from all of this. Can you imagine hating someone or hating a group of people so much that you actually wanted them to die? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But for the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about this topic. We've been talking about this theme that says that God is for us. And we've also been talking about how God calls us to be for others. God is for us, and God calls us to be for others. And not just our people, the ones who are kind and loving to us, but God calls us to be for everyone, even our greatest enemies. But God will never ask us to do something that God is not willing to do. You see, God modeled this for us, and we read this passage a couple weeks ago, and I want to revisit it here for a second. Romans chapter 5, verse 8 and 10, it says this, but Christ died for us, we were still sinners. And by this, God showed so much that he loves us. We have been made right with God by the blood and sacrifice of Christ. So through Christ, we will surely be saved from God's anger. I mean that while we were God's enemies, he made friends with us through his son's death. And the fact that we are now God's friends makes us even more certain that he will save us through his son's life. You see, right here, like the people of Nineveh, we too were once God's enemies. But aren't you glad that God doesn't treat us with hatred or even indifferently? Instead, God treated us with this thing called compassion, this thing called love. And through Jonah, God showed love and compassion. Those two very things that he showed to us, he showed them to the people of Nineveh. You see, you and I, we were once enemies of God. But aren't you glad for a moment that God doesn't treat us with hate? He doesn't treat us with indifference. God's message to Jonah is the same message that God gives us today. Just like God is for us, God is for our enemies too. So, who's our enemy? You see, Jonah's attitude towards the people of Nineveh wasn't completely unjustified. If you remember, the Assyrians had conquered, abused, and killed his people. And you may have experienced something terrible like that. If someone has hurt you, I'm not here to tell you to forget and forgive. In fact, if someone has hurt you and abused you in any way, I want to encourage you to reach out to us. Let us know how we can, let us know about us so we can help you walk through that process. My prayer is that you wouldn't try to process that situation all alone. We're here for you. But if you have an enemy for any other reason, I'm inviting you to a conversation with God, like the conversation that Jonah also had with God. For a moment, I want you to think for a second, who hurt me? Who have I not forgiven? Who would I love to see fail? Who would I truly want to see everyone else dislike as much as I dislike someone? And are there any people or groups of people that I wish God would simply just destroy? Now, if you've thought for a moment and you've thought about those people, you have some names and faces probably in your mind. How does it feel to hear that God is for that person? What do I want to ask or say to God? And how do you need God to transform the way you see that person? What would it look like for you to be for that person? So what would it look like for us to be for our enemies just like God is for us? It's hard. It's difficult. But the reality is, it's worth it. You see, the darkest moments of human history may have happened because of hate, but the brightest moments in human history have happened because of compassion, and they've happened because of love. You see, just like God brought us hope when we were God's enemies, we get to bring hope to others, even the people who are hard for us to love. This week, my prayer and my hope is that you would decide to show your enemies that you're for them. You know why? Because God is for them. Watch what God does. And instead of choosing anger or choosing hate, you choose to show love. And you also choose to show compassion.